Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm excited for our guest speaker today, Professor Matthew Palm from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Great public university like we have here at the University of California, Irvine. Matthew completed his PhD in geography at UC Davis, a nice little school up there in the north. We met a couple of weeks ago, I guess over a month ago now, at a conference UCLA at Lake Arrowhead, and I think we had a number of joint interests, including pedestrian infrastructure, data, and quality and assessment. Today we'll be hearing about another topic of local interest to us, which is the LA wildfires and ability associated with it. So please join me in welcoming Matthew.
Did not fly in from North Carolina today. Still late. Universities are not very good at wayfinding. Sorry about that. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I did as part of a large research team, understanding the mobility challenges of transit riders during the 2025 Los Angeles wildfires. And just because it's been a minute, I'm going to start by kind of giving us a refresh of what happened in the different parts of the LA Metro that were affected. And then I'm going to dive into our study and how we tried to answer a very basic question of how do transit riders and zero-car households evacuate? Because we have some evidence on this from hurricanes. The benefit of hurricanes is that we get a few days' notice. With fast-moving wildfires, sometimes we only have minutes, hours, and so the dynamics are really different. And so not having the same level of mobility resources can present a really big challenge for households that are trying to evacuate. And the LA wildfires kind of became this experiment in how you move large numbers of people who don't have cars out of an area. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that experience. So the wildfires, as they broke out in January of 2025, had very short and very uncertain evacuation windows. This is just an image of all the areas of the Pacific Palisades that were destroyed or damaged as a result of the fires. Folks in this community had really compressed decision time windows for evacuation. I'm on a separate project looking at why people in Pacific Palisades abandoned their cars and ran on foot. A lot of it had to do with the fact that they figured out there was a fire because they smelled it and saw it before they saw it, and suddenly they saw it was on their street. They just had to go. And of course, as you know and probably heard, there's really only two ways in or out of the Pacific Palisades, and it created a lot of problems. The uncertainty of trying to figure out how to get out was made worse in this fire as well as in Altadena by the shifting directions of the fires. This wasn't something that moved in one way consistently or predictably. It kind of bounced around and changed directions. And so we spoke to interviewees who thought they were going away from the fire only to realize, oh, actually the fire has changed direction. We were now heading towards it. We need to do a U-turn on Sunset. A bunch of people U-turning on Sunset equals the road getting even slower. And so this project, in particular, focusing on transit riders, looked at the entire Los Angeles metro area where you had a complex of firestorms occurring around the same time. And most of our survey responses are actually from people who evacuated the Eaton fire and the Sunset fire. As I'll show in a minute, those are two that encroached on areas that had much higher transit ridership. I'm sure you can imagine, being transportation people, Pacific Palisades doesn't exactly have high transit demand, but North Hollywood definitely does, and so does Pasadena. And so even though the Sunset Fire was put out very quickly and did not hop, I can't remember what road it was, but we had a lot of people worried it was going to hop this one road and just start burning through Hollywood. And that's an area with very high transit ridership and a lot of zero-car households. So just to give you a context and how that looks, these are the evacuation zones overlaid onto the number of zero-car households at the block group level. The block group data is messy, and unfortunately, the choices of some of our leaders are going to make it messier, but it's the best we have, so we're just going to roll with it for now. And it's worth noting, again, that the Sunset and Eaton fires encroach on denser, more urbanized parts of the city, where each neighborhood had well over 100 zero-car households. say with an average household size of 1.5, that's 150 people in each of those blue squares who don't own a car and are going to need some other means to evacuate. Also, interestingly, the mandatory evacuation zone for Pacific Palisades did get kind of deep into Santa Monica and into areas where, again, you had large numbers of people who don't own vehicles who were mandated to evacuate. Oh, I forgot I did that. Okay, great. So how do transit riders evacuate from wildfires? I'm going to talk first about, I want to acknowledge my project team. Maddie Brosnan Singh Kim at UCLA, who did a lot of the initial recruitment work. It's really important when doing any type of qualitative or mixed methods work to have a local partner because people are more likely to trust and engage with research when they know the institution. We also had colleagues at UC Davis, University of Washington, Cal Poly Sloan, and Utah State, who all kind of came together. This was funded through the Natural Hazards Center at CU Boulder. They have various calls for proposal for, what do they call it? It's so long now, I can't remember. It's like a rapid grant. So it's about helping you get into the field very quickly to collect perishable data. It's different than the NSF Rapids. Also, important side note, if you look into that funding for your own work, they do not award it to institutions, they award it to the individual. So you basically get paid cash to go collect the work. The reason being that if I'm, walking around a shelter of people who just evacuated and I'm interviewing them and I'm offering some sort of incentive to say, oh, you're going to get that in the mail in 3 to 6 weeks, from my university. People need, it doesn't work. So they created this special program that basically puts the cash in the researcher's hands that you can get right into the field doing whatever you need to do quickly. Because oftentimes, these things are unexpected, right? We don't know they're coming, and you've got days to get in the field to try and collect data before people maybe are going to start stop remembering, they're going to start forgetting, and you're going to run into issues of recall bias, right? So interesting program, worth checking it out for those of you who are in this space and doing work in that area. They've been really wonderful to work with, and I would encourage anybody here doing evacuation stuff to consider them as a future source of funding. Okay, so what were our 3 research questions? Knowing what, well, I'll just say, first one is just simply how do transit riders evacuate? I say transit riders, but I really meant zero-car households. How do you recruit zero-car households? It's not like there's a special social media site just for people with zero-car households. It's very difficult. So what we did is we recruited through the transit agency. So technically, this universe of people is transit riders. But the goal in doing that was to reach zero-car households because people without cars are relying more on transit. We wanted to look at what factors were associated with mode choice decisions. I had some colleagues push back on the term mode choice. These are folks not in transportation. They were like, there is no choice. That's the whole point of the research. I had to explain it's a technical, anyways. But it's a thing I do want to name because as some of the conversations we had with evacuees illustrated, there were just so many options off the table for people, and it put people in really serious binds. The last thing we looked at, this Natural Hazard Center call was partly related to public health and the health impacts of hazards. And so we wanted to understand how transit riders were adapting to the wildfire smoke. There's been a lot of research, I'm sure or maybe you've been involved in looking at like how transit riders are exposed to heat and cold. Unfortunately, as wildfires become more prevalent, exposure to smoke from wildfires is also another thing we wanted to look at in an important area. I'll talk quickly about the literature. So wildfire evacuation research has traditionally been very car-centric. A lot of the simulations that had been done just kind of assume car ownership. Not only do they assume car ownership, but they kind of, at least back in the day, assume sort of every household is kind of as an island upon itself, where everybody's got the car, everyone's at home when the fire starts, and everyone's evacuating together. And I think the big thing about these fires is the first one started at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. So a lot of folks were at work. And in households where, say, one partner has the car to go to work and the other partner stays at home, they're a car owning household, but functionally that person who's back home is carless during the day and needs to be considered as part of the population that needs support in evacuating. So we wanted to try and push the conversation beyond the sort of car-centric assumptions of evacuation and try to use this particular disaster as an opportunity to learn about that. This has also been a long identified gap in the literature. Again, this conversation came to a head in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, and a lot of people were left behind by that. There was a lot of research and planning around helping folks without cars evacuate during hurricanes. A lot of agencies on the East Coast have registries of riders that they will check in on before a hurricane that's coming to help evacuate them. Something we've started to maybe talk about is something that should be done in California. And some agencies in California actually do that, as I'll explain here in a minute. There's a lot of great work that's been done looking at the potential for ride hailing in particular to support evacuation. There have been models. There was a study that came out about South Carolina that asked people if they were willing to share their privately owned self-driving car with an evacuee. And everyone said, yeah, I will, which raises the question of why aren't people sharing their cars now? So I have an issue with the stated preference surveys about AVs. We've talked about this. Although I will say in the end, shared rides ended up playing, informal ride sharing was a really important part of the evacuation process. So how do we encourage people to do that? How do we match people is a real question. And before I dive into our methods, my colleague Tara Goddard at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo did a really interesting study, also funded by the National Hazard Center, about the Caldor fire, which came out in 2021. This was a fire that hit South Lake Tahoe pretty hard. And the Tahoe Transportation District successfully evacuated 1,800 people. These were, again, regular transit riders who had signed up on a registry saying, if I ever need to quickly evacuate a fire, I would want to ride Tahoe Transit District. They also helped evacuate 500 unhoused people who lived in different parts of the area on top of this. And this was another fast-moving wildfire context. It's the closest study to what we did. And the big takeaways that they had from that experience was the bus drivers were very generous in kind of being flexible about letting evacuees bring what they wanted to bring. So they didn't enforce rules about how much luggage you could bring on. They didn't enforce rules about pets. It was just, there's a fire coming, you can smell it, you probably can start to see the embers, just get on board. And that made a big difference in then successfully getting people out the door. And the transit agency had also established relationships with partner organizations that worked in the community. So the organization that provided support for the unhoused, the mental health unit that works with the unhoused. So they kind of knew where these folks usually are, where they usually hang out during the day. And so we're able to basically rock up with a bus and say, hey, this is literally your last bus ride out of Dodge, and people were able to get on board and get out. And here's actually a Facebook post about that, which is really interesting. And you can see here a lot of attention brought to pets. This is something that also came up in our research on Los Angeles. Okay, so how do you reach transit riders? Who here rides transit? I mean, I get it, it's Irvine.
I mean, like regularly or occasionally?
Oh,
I occasionally.
occasionally, okay.
Yeah.
What apps do you use transit app, anyone here?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Tell me about the transit app.
It's like, it's useful, but it's frustrating. Because like its routing system is really unintuitive, but it has really good real-time information if you know how to navigate it.
So this is,
So-
yeah, so this is a real-time bus arrival app. There's another one that was started by Kerry Watkins,
The next bus.
Next Bus, and this is like kind of like that. So transit app will let you survey people. You have to pay them $7,000. It's really cheap though, and they will run a banner that kind of looks like this at the top of the screen for people using the app over a 2-week period. Yeah, it's really helpful, and then they will do one push notification for you for people who have enabled it. Yeah, which is pretty cool, and they'll do it in all the languages that you're able to provide it. I think though in LA, they just had the app in English and Spanish, if I remember correctly. And so,
You can also use Google Maps. If a transit system is participating, you get real-time information. You really do. I mean, I used it in New York recently.
oh yeah, I mean, they're competing with Google Maps, yeah, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to do anything special. I mean,
The
it's.
difference though is with this app, what they're doing is they're saying, hey, well, first off, this is an app that like only transit nerds pretty much use, or like people who like frequently use transit, like it's designed for that purpose.
Sure.
And then also they're saying, well, his point is their push notifications, which Google's never gonna let you do to a bunch of their users. They're saying, hey, if you're a transit user, tell it UCLA is interested in what you're doing.
Oh, sure. But
that's the
if you're
purpose.
concerned about vehicle arrival.
I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he's talking about getting the survey data, no?
Okay.
Yeah, but no, I mean, you don't need the app to get around. You can
Yeah,
use
yeah,
Google
that's
Maps.
fine.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. They try to offer a bunch of other, like, payment through the app and other kinds of stuff, and but it does mean that we're only getting the population of folks who use this app, right? Which is a limit, and it's transit nerds. Although in LA, they have about, I mean, this ran for 2 weeks and I think it was seen by 300,000 different users. I don't know if there are that many transit nerds in LA, but
Could be, I don't know.
so, but yeah, it's
10%
frequent, this is biased towards frequent users.
Yeah, I think in LA, you have more transit users because of the free transit programs. Like essentially all the poor kids are transit users because they have free access to transit.
Yes,
And
and-
their school district participates, which is the case for most of the school districts, including LAUSD.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right.
No, yeah, and what's interesting about that is, what it comes up in the interviews that the free transit was really helpful for evacuees afterwards, right? Especially if they were living in a neighborhood where they didn't really know how to get around, or maybe they left their car behind. There's a lot of people who left their car behind and they're carless for 3 months, and having fairless transit was really helpful. We made the mistake of not convincing UCLA's IRB so that we didn't have to put the full consent form on the front page. That was bad. If you can try to avoid making people read 8 paragraphs about how they can complain to an IRB, I would encourage you to figure that out. Because we had like 10,000 people click on the first page. We only got like 800 valid responses. That was a lesson learned, but again, for what we spent on it, this is not a bad deal in terms of research. People took a survey, it averaged about 10 minutes in length. And it had an 86% completion rate on people who clicked past that consent form. And then from that, we recruited 38 people for semi-structured interviews. We tried to finish all the interviews within 3 months of the wildfire. Because we were concerned about people's memory and recall bias and whatnot. This presented a challenge though, because we had a small sample. And one of the things that we were told right away when we were talking with community organizers in these neighborhoods was that a lot of these evacuations were very multimodal. So we simply asked people, what means of travel did you use to evacuate? And we let them kind of select all that apply. And that created some complications in analyzing the data. So we tested demographic differences in whether or not each mode was a part of their evacuation using Fisher tests, because we had a small sample of about 156 evacuees. And so I'll be talking over these results. Because we were also interested in how air quality impacts transit travel behavior, people who didn't evacuate could take the survey. We had about 600 non-evacuees take the survey. And we kind of wanted to ask them about evacuation, even though they didn't. So we said, well, if you had to have evacuated, how likely would you have been to use each of these various modes? So we have a stated preference from non-evacuees, and we have a revealed preference from the people who actually did it. Of course, they're different people because they're in different geographies and parts of the city. And with these, we ran binary logistic regressions on whether or not non-evacuees thought they were very likely to use each of these modes. It's not perfect, but it led to some interesting results. And there's some similarities and differences between what evacuees actually did and what non-evacuees thought they probably would do or were likely to do in a crisis.
I'm curious with this platform, are you able to get, okay, this user ID took my survey, can I also get the travel profile or the regular travel profile of that user ID?
Oh, from the app?
Yeah, from the app.
Oh, I wish Transit app would allow that. I'm sure that's a whole, I think I saw my colleague, Dr. Kapatsula on the call. He does a lot of work with them. Are you there? Have they ever given you that opportunity? He works with a lot of their survey data. We'll see if he replies. No, we weren't able to do that, unfortunately. Okay, sample demographics. Very diverse pool, only about 20% white Caucasian. That's actually overrepresented still for LA Metro's onboard survey, says only about 10% of the ridership is white generally. So there's still that traditional survey bias that exists towards more historically underrepresented groups being underrepresented in the data, but it's not as bad. Certainly not as bad as if we had done a mail survey or even a random digit. So part of the demographic skew here is a reflection of what areas of the city were most affected by the fires, particularly both the fact that two of the fires that encroached on the city were on the west side, the Sunset Fire and the Palisades Fire. Gender balance was pretty good. For those doing survey research, one of the sort of perennial challenges we have now is men do not like to take surveys. So whenever I see, whenever men are more than 40% of the sample, it's like amazing. The only time I've ever had a male dominated sample was about riding e-scooters at night. That was different. About a third of the sample, households with children, 20% older adults, half of the households had pets. That was wild to me, but I guess a lot of us had pets. And 40% of the sample were people in households with no car access. And again, that's kind of what's really important for us, because in a lot of these surveys of evacuees, that number is 1, 2, 3, 4%. So we have a large pool. It is a convenience sample because it's app users of a specific app for a specific mode, but the fact that we were able to capture several hundred zero-car households in this survey was really important. Again, the actual population of people was a bit skewed spatially towards the fires. So here on the left these are the three main fires we were interested in. Blue dots are evacuees. What was interesting is there were a few people who evacuated who did not live anywhere near the fires. And in follow-up interviews, we found out it was air quality issues and they evacuated the region. We talked to some people who were like, who just got in an Uber, went to LAX and went to who knows where on like the first day, which was really interesting.
So your target population was the whole county then?
Yeah, I should clarify, it was, the transit app does the banner by agency service area. So we just said, okay, we're just gonna have to do the whole county. We can't really target. I should mention that Access LA also sent a blast out to all of their users. And so we got 40 respondents from Access LA, that's the paratransit service for LA County. And you can see that our sample is very spatially concentrated near downtown. And that does to some extent reflect where bus riders are. So LA Metro gave us the ridership numbers during the week of the fire, and you can see each dot here represents 50 boardings. And there's a healthy correlation between where bus ridership is concentrated and where a lot of our respondents are. And the areas that are overrepresented are like the actual evacuation zones, which was very useful for our purposes.
Does Santa Monica have its own agency?
Santa Monica has the Big Blue Bus. Because of some agreements that they have with LA Metro, basically their users also saw the transit app ads. So all of the agencies in the area. So we had folks at Big Blue Bus who participated. We had folks at Foothill Transit, which is service for that area as well.
But those boardings are not reflected in the boarding map.
Correct. Yes, actually, yes. Yes, that's right. Okay, so how do transit riders evacuate? So this number will exceed 100% because people could select options. Almost half of respondents got a ride from friends or family members. We are kicking ourselves for this, but we did not differentiate between if you got a ride from someone in your household versus out of your household. So some chunk of these are people who just got rides from maybe their spouse who owns the car or their roommate who owns a car. The next most common mode was walking. About a quarter walked as a part of their evacuation. About a quarter took their own car, and about a fifth each took transit and took ride hailing. Very few people evacuated by bicycle. We do have one story of somebody in Altadena who did multiple bike trips from his house to a friend's house to drop stuff off. So yeah, hard to do on a bike. I don't recommend it. And then we even had one person say they used car share.
But yeah, I was going to ask, what does car sharing mean in this context? Is it
Maybe Zika.
like different from riding it with a friend?
Yeah.
Oh.
There are
Oh, I
codes
see.
that you can
Okay.
access.
Is
One
it
of
more-
these that you can rent. Oh,
Yeah, like zip car, yeah.
Did you ask if someone is selected, I took my own car, then did you pick anyone else up?
No, that's another thing I wish we had done. But still useful. Some quotes from our interviews about the process of getting the rides. A lot of uncertainty around this, a lot of tension, a lot of guilt. One interviewee said there were points in the middle where I wasn't sure which friend would take me or who was where. So a lot of people were making multiple calls and texts to various people they knew who had a car. And a lot of the stress of the evacuation was trying to figure out who that person was going to be, when they were, how soon could they pick me up. There was one gentleman who, this guy ended up buying a car because of his experience, but he said I was totally dependent on someone else's decision making. I think there's probably one person who didn't own a car who lived in the Palisades Highlands. We somehow found him. Which I maybe shouldn't have said out loud because that could violate anonymity. So just I thought I didn't say that for IRB purposes. He got a ride from his landlord. He was living in an ADU behind someone's house, and several people knew he didn't own a car and reached out to him and said, "Hey, we're leaving now. Do you want to hop in?" And he said, "No, I'm going to go with my landlord." And then his landlord decided his landlord wanted to stay and fight. And he starts to panic. And then his landlord's wife, he said it like had a total meltdown and like screamed at him. And so he got in the car. And that's the only reason why he evacuated. So he was totally dependent on someone on his landlord's wife, guilt tripping his landlord into making the right decision. So, I mean, this is a very when you're relying on informal rides, you know, it's a very intimate and stressful process for people. This is another fun one. I drove my grandma. Yeah, in her car, yes. The one time she let me drive it. Yay. We also had a lot of folks who admitted that they shouldn't be driving, or particularly people from the Access LA sample who were like, yeah, I use Access LA because I can have seizures or I have poor vision, but I didn't wait around for them and I still had my car and I still had my keys. So there was quite a bit of that as well. A lot of people mentioned feeling bad about asking for rides from folks in other parts of the city. You know, I'm asking you to drive into the fires, and that just seems like a really scary and awful thing to ask. This came up for particularly for ride hailing, people feeling guilty. There was one person who thought that he was Waymo's #1 rider in LA. And he asked Waymo to evacuate, and Waymo said, we are not allowed to go into the evacuation zones. He got very, very angry. And so he felt guilty that he had to call an Uber, and he wanted us to tell Waymo to change that policy, but that was actually a policy set by the city or the county, I guess, because they're worried about the car doesn't know how to handle the debris. But it was really interesting. Okay, transit. Evacuating by transit is very messy. This was one respondent who said, I just ended up taking up the bus. Public transportation, even then, was really delayed. They were rerouting everything and it was so confusing. So I had to walk a few blocks up to catch one of the other buses that goes into downtown LA. I think this is also her. I don't know how to word it, but there was a lot of movement and a lot of transfers, and I was tapping everywhere I was going because I didn't want to get into trouble. Normally, it would have just taken me $2 to get to Inglewood. So her normal bus to get to another part of the city was shut down, had been rerouted. And so she was also seeing some buses were stuck in evacuation areas. So she got out and walked a few blocks to get to cross streets that were not congested and just hop on a bus there, and spent the whole day on a fun adventure trying to find a spontaneous alternative route out of Los Angeles. This was someone who also mentioned that Transit app was trying to provide real-time information to all of the riders about those rerouting, but there was so much going on so quickly that it was very chaotic and hard to follow. I'm not actually sure what the policy solution is there when you are rerouting dozens of routes at once and on a very short time frame, but something to pay attention to is people who did try transit had a lot of trouble. We also had a survey respondent in Altadena who waited for the bus, not realizing that once the evacuation zone was declared, the buses were supposed to stop going. And so she waited several hours, got some smoke exposure, and eventually just called a friend. Okay. This was another good interview. There was somebody who took the bus into Altadena for work, and during their training at like a Taco Bell, like, you know, it's like it was a normal day when he walked in, when he walked out, like the world was a mess. And the buses had stopped running. And so he realized, okay, I guess I just have to walk home. And a lot of the people where their primary who did a lot of walking that day were transit riders who just kind of gave up waiting for a bus. And he described walking home through areas that were burning or had been burned, and realizing, oh, there's too much debris for the buses to actually to even get through the street. So the #1 predictor of whether or not someone used a mode to evacuate as part of their evacuation is if they used it in their regular daily life or not, which was really interesting. So
Familiarity, you say.
exactly, familiarity, habit. So we asked people in the pre-fire period, how many days a week would you use each mode as part of your daily mobility? And we basically, because we had such a small sample, we cut this group into half, and we said, okay, if you use this mode 2 days a week or less, you use it infrequently. And if you use it 3 days or more, you use it frequently. So, and then we compared frequent users of the mode with infrequent users of the mode. We looked at their use of that mode. I'm saying that word too much. So for example, if I rode transit frequently before the fire, 30% of those folks use it to evacuate. If I did not use transit that often, if I was an occasional rider, only 10% of those folks use transit as a part of their mode. So you can see the biggest gap was to what extent somebody got rides with other people. If I'm relying on other people for rides most days of the week, that is how I got out. And this pattern was also very pronounced for ride hailing. So people who were, I guess, committed regular users of ride hailing were more likely to just switch into that mode. So what I'm familiar with, what I know, what my habits are pre-evacuation were very strong predictors of evacuation. I want to talk a little bit more about something that this study kind of revealed to us that we didn't expect was, even though it was about, what are the barriers that you face when you don't own a car, was a lot of people realizing that they weren't always at a disadvantage, that they weren't using their cars. So I'll start with this quote here on the right. This was somebody who lived in West Hollywood, said, I go on the rooftop of my building, I see the traffic is not moving. It was at a standstill. I said, no way, I trust my life. I trust me with my life before I trust Uber or the Metro, and I didn't even see the Metro. So a lot of people particularly in Altadena and West Hollywood, they saw how crazy the traffic was, and they were like, cars aren't actually better for me right now. I'm gonna walk. A lot of people, and in that case, I mean, you only had to walk a mile or two and you were out of harm's way. In other cases, it was a little bit different. This is Access LA rider. Everybody was packed up and ready to go for themselves. I called 911. The 911 operator said they were stretched too thin. Nobody could help me get out. So I just started walking south on Michelinda. This is a 73-year-old woman with some health problems. So couldn't drive herself, couldn't find anyone who got a ride. A lot of elders in Altadena who maybe didn't have a lot of friends or family in the area are the people who are most likely to end up in this situation. So I don't have a car, I fall back on my social resources. And if I don't have a lot of social resources or connections in the area, I'm stuck. And so a lot of those 911 calls were about those folks who were stuck. Here's another one. I had friends 2 or 3 miles away, so I just started walking. So the big use of walking was to avoid traffic, or just recognizing it might be the easiest or only way out. Ride hailing, although it wasn't only used by a fifth of people, came up kind of spontaneously as a backup for people. And so there were quite a few people who waited around for a friend to pick them up. The friend didn't come and they just said, screw it, I'm just gonna take Uber, and describing it as not longer than usual to get a ride. Go ahead.
How could Uber offer free rides? Because I mean, the drivers pay the gas and their time. So what does it mean? It means that Uber was not taking their cuts, or?
That's a good question. I think Uber, I don't know the internal mechanics of that. The free rides were only limited if you were in the evacuation zone going to one of 12 shelters. But most people were not going to the shelters. Most people were getting rides to friends' houses, families' houses. And those folks, some of them were happy, some of them felt like they were being, what is it called, surge priced. So there was some controversy about that.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Uber said that the driver revenue was not affected.
Okay, so they paid themselves for the expenses. I mean, for the.
They didn't go that far, but they said Uber drivers' income is not.
I mean, you could assume that it's worth
I'm
it
just-
for their marketing team, right? They
Yeah,
get
what
some
does it
cost here, but maybe it convinces people to be like, wow, Uber is such an amazing company, so I'm gonna use them.
Okay, Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping
Yeah.
that they paid the drivers, right?
I think that's a good assumption,
Okay,
but they didn't go that far.
okay, I'm sure they did.
My father-in-law has probably taken 300 Southwest flights because Southwest was the last plane to leave New Orleans when Katrina happened.
Sorry, Zach, it's kind of same thing.
Yeah, that's some customer loyalty. Yeah, and these are just quotes about people's, oh, she can't pick us up, that's okay. We're gonna figure it out on our own, and that's when I realized we're gonna have to do. So Uber is an important backup. When we looked at how car access influenced mode choice, obviously, people who had a car in their household, 40% of them evacuated by that car. Somebody who said they don't own a car said they evacuated by their own car, probably a data error or someone misunderstanding a survey question. And then, of course, transit, Uber, and walking were higher for people who don't have a car. So what was interesting is getting rides from others was the same, maybe partly because how people had interpreted our question. Their spouse drove the family car out, but yeah, just test your survey over and over.
Is it possible the one person said they used their car, but they don't own a car? Maybe they don't own that car.
Why did they say they took their own?
They don't own the car, but they just have the car.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
oh, yeah, hey, yeah, there we go. Thank you, that's helpful. Intra-car household car sharing. This was really interesting. A lot of people borrowed cars from their like building managers or landlords or boss or whatever. So there was one couple in Santa Monica. They were talking to their building manager. They're kind of friends with him. He said, here's the door code to my apartment. The keys are hanging right there, and I've got some money stuck there. Get it, grab it, take what you need to go. So yeah, people were looking out for me. This is the building manager letting his tenants take his car and his money. I know, what a great landlord. So a lot of stuff like that. This was somebody who his boss had an extra car and said, use my truck. We thought we would catch a ride, but then he just gave us the vehicle. So not only was there ride sharing, but there was also kind of informal car sharing going on as well, which was an important part of the story. Again, Uber was an important backup. Here was somebody who she and her roommate thought their third roommate with the car would help them, and then she just kind of left. It was kind of a sad and awkward conversation. And they ended up having to prepare backup rides as well. We also took a look at disability status. So how did people with disabilities evacuate? Because this is a population where that has long been identified in evacuation research as needing that support and help with mobility, and far more likely to use public transportation and to walk. Also more likely to use their own car because they're more likely to have their own car. But the higher use of transit for people with disabilities was kind of interesting and unexpected, at least for me. And it kind of revealed how, particularly if I don't have a friend or family member around who can come quickly pick me up, and I have a mobility impairment, and I've just got to get out of Altadena, people just took whatever option was available and still.
Did you separate between mental and physical disabilities?
Great question. We only asked about physical for this.
Okay. So I would imagine in two ways. One, if you have a mental disability like autism, but on a lower level where you're still able to function somewhat.
Yeah.
Some people like that are very into their routines, so they always take the bus. They might just want to take the bus, even if there's other options. And then for mental disabilities like Alzheimer's with dementia, I actually had a friend of mine so when these fires happened, there were also fires in Corona, which is where I'm from. And they closed the 91 freeway. And everyone works in Orange County. And my friend's grandma lives with him, and she has Alzheimer's and also only speaks Vietnamese and Cantonese. So she didn't get the evacuation stuff and he asked me to go pick her up. By that time, the firefighters had already closed it off. So I just told them and they kicked down the door, got her. But yeah, that's maybe something.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. On the intellectual disability side. Yeah. Okay, couple more things about ride hailing. People were so grateful they could take their cats and dogs on Uber. Thank God for Uber. They weren't picky. I don't know what everyone's experience is. Like, you normally can't go with the cat, but they knew what was going on. Sometimes they're like, oh, we don't take pets. This time they didn't say anything. Just thank God for that. So we did find evidence of that. And again, that was something that came up in the Caldor fire is people are evacuating. It's not your normal commute. They're bringing their pets, they're bringing their stuff. And so flexibility on the part of the drivers being really important and really beneficial. We had a couple of people who, again, this speaks back to the discounted rides were only for going to the shelters. And so for folks going elsewhere, they experienced whatever pricing surge or not that was going on. And there were people who even considered changing their destination for evacuation because of that free ride. This is a quote from someone who decided ultimately they did not take Uber because they wanted to go to a hotel and didn't want to pay the full price of an Uber to get to the hotel. We also had people who were too kind of stressed out that they didn't bother to put the code in to get the free ride, even though that's where they were going. I thought that was interesting. Maybe if they're going to within 100 meters of the shelter, just make it free. I don't know. Okay. So when we built a statistical model predicting how non-evacuees, whether or not they said they were likely to evacuate by each mode, we found that people with very low incomes were much more likely to say, yes, I'll probably evacuate by by transit. Obviously, intentions to evacuate by transit were lower for people who owned a car and higher for people who rode the bus. And basically across the board, when we looked at, this is the stated preference, would you consider this mode? The strongest predictor is, do I already? So in both the stated preference and the observed preference data, the modes I use regularly strongly predict which mode I would use to evacuate. So frequent Uber users, 1.4 times as likely to say I would evacuate with ride hail compared to people who are not frequent users. And then
Women are more likely to use their cars.
yeah, women were not more likely to use their own car. I do not know why. That did not come up in interviews. Might have been a kind of this was a small sample, it's about 350 people, so that we had complete data for.
One thing I thought, and it was because, I take it for instance. He said that normally men are underrepresented, but men were more represented than usual. And that this sampled people from West Hollywood. I don't know if some of these men are homosexual men and if their behavior may be different than heterosexual men in certain ways.
That's fascinating. And I actually, are you familiar with Mike Smart's work on, well, yeah, there's a whole research angle there. Is this supposed to end at 11? Am I going late?
No, I mean, some people had a meeting about them, but you're good.
Okay, so keep running along. Older adults were less likely to say they would use ride hailing, low income folks more likely to use transit. And then I will talk very briefly about the health side of it. So we did ask people about what symptoms they experienced during their commutes or just in general during that 2-week period. And most transit riders experience some kind of symptoms, most common being eye irritation, chronic headaches, difficulty breathing, very large proportions. This is across the entire study area. And so again, when you think about And this comes up in the exposure literature that transit riders, particularly who have to wait a while or have to make transfers, are more exposed. We asked people about how they adapted their behavior during the wildfires to try and minimize exposure and symptoms. And the two biggest things were drinking more water and wearing masks. So about 63% of transit riders were masking during that period. A little over a quarter said they were avoiding riding public transit. So kind of like with COVID, although we've started to conceptualize it as COVID in reverse. Because with COVID, you didn't want to be in an enclosed space, you wanted to be outside, but with air quality, you want to be inside. But in both cases, people were avoiding public transportation. They were explicitly avoiding going outside or traveling during peak smoke conditions. And we did find a significant number of people who just switched to getting rides, switched to taking Uber, shortening their trips, avoiding crowded buses. And about 10% of people, this came up a lot in our interviews, would change their routes to avoid transfers. So there were a few bus riders we spoke to who they could stay on one bus for like an hour to get somewhere, or they could make a transfer and it would only be 30 minutes. And they would take that longer trip for that next 2 weeks to avoid smoke exposure. So a lot of route choice changes to try and minimize smoke
For
exposure.
any of those questions, did you ask either, have you experienced being in an area with wildfire before? So in the sense that maybe they've dealt with smoke events before, and if they're, those two groups, first time versus I've done it before, they're different. And also people who maybe they grew up in areas where they would have the smog warnings, like where I grew up, there would be days during the year where you can't go play outside at recess because the air is too bad. So, you have to wear masks to go to school and things. So I don't know if that would change people's behavior.
We asked in the interviews if people had prior wildfire experience, and that is a very strong predictor of like preparedness.
Mhm.
And like we even spoke to like one person who was like born during the Witch Creek fire in San Diego, which is one of the biggest fires and biggest evacuations in history, in the state's history, which I also lived through. And she was like, yeah, so it's always something we talk about. And so when it was time to leave UCLA, she was a UCLA student, I was like, oh, okay, it's like I've been doing this since I was born. And I was like, okay, wow. So yeah, I mean, it definitely, prior wildfire experience, it definitely shaped people's attitudes. And I think it's something we're looking at mostly through our interview data that we're still combing through. There was a huge drop. So we asked people to compare how many days a week they used on average each sort of mode of travel before the fires versus during that early post-fire period. And the biggest drop in mode usage was bicycling. People stopped biking. People were traveling less in general. I mean, things were closed with the air pollution and whatnot. But huge drop in bicycling. And this was again to avoid air pollution exposure, and a lot of people who switched to the bus. And there is actually some research that was done looking at Washington, D.C.'s metro area over several years where wildfire smoke would come down from Canada. And they found that in block groups where active travel modes were a higher share of commuting, they would see a bump in subway ridership during bad air days. So you've got people avoiding the bus and switching to cars, but you also have people switching to the bus from walking and biking. So there's a lot of kind of really complex dynamics in the behavior change and as people try to minimize their exposure to air pollution. So I'll end on changes in attitudes towards owning a car. So I mentioned the 1-0 car household in Pacific Highlands. He said, I have a car now. I don't drive it that much, but I got one because there is some comfort in knowing that I could drive out somewhere. So that experience of waiting for his landlord to come to his senses, that he could get a ride out, just changed his attitude towards driving. Fires, another person, changed my perspective a lot. I'm more anxious. My anxiety makes me want to get a car, just knowing that this potentially could happen. This is someone saving up to get a car who did not have one. We also spoke to someone who moved to Santa Monica after being displaced from Pacific Palisades and said that she never wanted to live in a neighborhood ever again where there were only two ways in or out. And that she loved that Santa Monica had a grid and she could go in every direction. Which I was like, I get it. I mean, after being probably stuck on Sunset. In terms of our implications for policy and the things we want to advise, is that a lot of education is necessary to tell transit riders, you really can't assume the bus is coming. The buses may stop. They may be asking, folks may be need to know that they can't rely on that mode. And they also need to be prepared to have up to 3 people they can call for a ride if they don't have a car. So we were even at a workshop with some folks at LA Metro trying to brainstorm, like, what's the slogan? Like, know your ride, know your way out. Like, how do you do an educational campaign? Because there were a lot of people who, it wasn't the first or second person that they got a ride out with, it was the third person that they hit up. And having that redundancy in your own network. Of course, during these crises, we want to aggressively communicate service changes. This was something, again, that was happening, but because there was so much going on, I think riders were overwhelmed. I'm not sure what to do about that problem. Something I didn't talk about a lot in this talk, but a lot of people who were displaced by the fires really appreciated that anyone affected by the fire got a free transit pass from LA Metro, the Life Pass. That really helped. It helped particularly people who maybe they were a 2-car household, they left 1 car behind and it was burned, they had less mobility. Being able to pick up the slack with buses with free transit was important. Another thing I mentioned here, or I didn't mention, but it did come up, was for displaced people, parking became a very big challenge because, maybe I lived in a suburban home where I had a garage where I could park, but now I'm living out of hotels and Airbnbs and I'm bouncing around until that aid comes through from the federal government for permanent housing. And I'm trying to figure out where can I leave my car so that I'm not getting ticketed or towed. Potential future research area, something to think about as well. And yeah, that's all. Would love to hear more. I've appreciated the questions, really interesting thoughts from folks. And if there's other questions or folks online have thoughts, love to hear those as well. Go for it.
You presented a model result, right? Binary logistic. What was the sample size for that model?
They were about 359.
Okay, so
Yeah.
what did it about it?
Yeah, these are non-evacuees. This is the control group or state of preference. Yeah, people. It was interesting. I almost didn't present the evacuate by your own car model because everyone who owns a car pretty much said yes to that. The model kind of, which might be why we have the random spurious gender result. I don't know. The other ones we felt confident about, but what I will say is doing research on evacuations, it is very hard to honor all the assumptions of good statistical research practice because, yeah.
What do you think, I mean, you mentioned a little bit, what do you think that transit companies, perhaps, transit agencies perhaps could do differently? I'm kind of wondering, did they divert their fleet into the area or that would have made a difference?
The smaller agencies did provide evacuation buses. So Big Blue Bus actually they pulled up a couple of vehicles off some routes and they set them in some high traffic areas and said, come here if you need a ride out.
LA Transit strikes me as someone that would be pretty active.
I know they did something like that as well. I just can't remember off the top of my head. They LA Metro originally did not have a policy to do stuff like that. And I think a lot of their buses are electric and there was a fear about sending electric buses towards fires. So you can imagine. And I was even giving a talk at LA Metro and there was some conversation in the Zoom chat where someone was like, wait, weren't we banned from doing this because the buses are electric? And like, no, we were. And wait, we helped people evacuate? No, we didn't. Yes, we did. It was really interesting. It's a huge organization, right? And it's caught up into these divisions that, but they did end up sending buses up to evacuate. And Foothill as well sent buses in to evacuate. What do you call those places when someone is of age and they live in a home?
Group home?
Group
Halfway
homes.
home?
Group homes, yeah, for seniors, for older adults.
Okay.
We did,
So I was gonna say, I think LA Metro also, as they said, we're moving a lot of resources into fire zones for firefighting as well, including firefighters and equipment as well.
I mean, yeah. And part of it was a challenge. They talked about the logistics of just, well, if you're gonna have buses go and pick up people at nursing homes, which route are you pulling them from, right? Because in other parts of the city, people are still trying to get to work, and it's a lot of trade-offs and complications there but I think to get to your question about what can agencies do, I think education around telling people, you can't assume the bus is gonna show up, it's a natural disaster, right? There could be debris in the way, have 3 people you can call, make a plan. Think about how you could walk to safety and just really going hard on the education.
Do you know the number of people like who got these free buses for the fire affected?
That's great. I don't know how many people took advantage of it, but I mean, of course, I'm sure the agency would know. You're curious.
This isn't the greatest question, but I'm thinking it, so I'm gonna ask it, out of curiosity. Could, in theory, people who are mobile have walked out and survived? I mean, is that an option if you don't take things with you?
Absolutely. I mean, at least in this case, because a lot of people did that. But if you mean people who had mobility impairments.
No, not, I'm just saying,
In general, yeah.
in this particular fire, in theory, if you left when they told you to, I'm more kind of wondering if the evacuation orders were appropriate.
I mean, many people do walk out.
I know, but I mean, do we evacuate people in time for them to walk out? Do we make that call in time for people to walk out? Again, I admit it's not a great question.
That's an empirical question that we could answer pretty easily, knowing when, that's a good question. No, I don't.
I just wonder if the evacuation orders could be adjusted. I know for me, I'd rather evacuate.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned that there was a big difference between the 2 surveys that you asked from people who really evacuated and those who are imagined to evacuate. But you didn't, I guess, show the mode share result from the other group. So I wanted to know how the mode share results between these 2 groups, especially between car and transit, are changing.
We
You
did-
showed one, slide 23 for people who really evacuated.
Yeah, we actually did make a figure of that. Let me just pull it up. Okay, so this is actually manuscripts. Okay, so this is red is actual evacuees, whether or not they use the mode. Blue is whether a non-evacuee said they were very likely to use mode if they had to. So this is the difference between the stated and the observed. And basically, there isn't a huge difference, except way more of the non-evacuees thought they would use their car to get out compared to the number of share of evacuees who did, which was kind of weird to us because the difference in car ownership was not very big between the 2 groups. But it kind of, I mean, part of it is these are households that are, what E.V. Blumenberg would call like car deficit, or households where adults are sharing a car, and I think people think in the abstract, oh yeah, I'd just take our car, but if my spouse has the car on the other side of town, I'm not, right? And so that, I think, explains that gap a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Is there any I think that you did your role responded to multiple choice, multiple choice and that questions. Is there any specific reason to make them allow them to check the multiple question, like multiple answers instead of just single answer?
I mean, the motivation was we knew that there was a lot of multimodality in advance, just because we had heard stories, where somebody walks 5 miles to the bus stop, and we wanted to capture both of those components. But I mean, yeah, I guess we could have asked, like, what was the primary mode? But there's a way you do that when you ask a mode choice question, and that might have led to some different results. And
Yeah, I think vacation situation is pretty extreme situation than the usual conditions. So maybe it would be pretty different if they are just forced to choose just primary modes instead of just plans.
I feel like it'd be hard to define primary too. I mean, you mean primary like in time, primary in distance, primary in what was most stressful or most exhausting,
Most critical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's always different. People might conceptualize that question very different.
I remember you mentioned about doing the Fisher test for checking the demographics. I think I missed that. Like, can you just
I just realized I didn't actually present the results of the Fisher test, but I can share. I'll pull up the paper again. You can see why I didn't present it, 'cause it's really ugly, but. So, let's see, see all we're missing. There we go. Okay, so it's gender differences, none were significant. There was a race difference on transit, so Black and Hispanic or Latino riders were more likely to evacuate via transit compared to white respondents. I actually forgot that was in there. I guess I'll just deal with it. There was also, for very low income households, they were more likely to evacuate by car, which I was confused by. They were also more likely to evacuate by transit.
On some of these, in this type of a test, do you need to hold out one group as a reference category, or can you have every group?
This Fisher is like a chi-squared, for like small sample, which is why we had to do it, because we like failed the chi-squared test.
And I guess one other thing is, when we're talking about someone's heritage, is it meaningful to separate out anyone who says I have heritage from more than one group and just a lumped mixed category? Or could you just make all the groups like alone or in combination? Such that, like, imagine if I selected I am both African American and Caucasian, could you just add them to both?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. We did not have, we had list of ethnicities, and we said just select all that apply. So we know everyone who identifies as part of each group or not. We only reported it this way because that's how LA Metro did on their rider survey, and we wanted to check for representativeness. But that is another thing we could look at and like pull out, and it's actually kind of a deeper problem with looking at like equity issues. I mean, besides the fact that they're trying to make it illegal for us to talk about equity, but well, not here in California. Yay, thank you, California. Is that as more and more people are multiple, that's happening. That's going to keep happening. How do we like either talk about or operationalize it is an open question. Yeah, great question.
I think Montana's politically incorrect answer for that women driving more cars. I was like thinking about it. Right, like probably in the Palisades and so on, there were a lot of people, like women just taking care of kids, and if you have kids, you take the car. So I don't think maybe the both answers are explaining that.
There, something like
I
that.
found it interesting.
I don't mean to imply that homosexual men are more like women, but
Yeah.
I'm
I guess I don't mean to imply that women take more care of kids than men, but maybe that's a.
There's a whole mobility.
That's a fact.
Yes,
It's these things that we are not allowed to say.
No, I mean. Look, I'm a gay man and I love public transportation and there is a thing about gay people loving public, that's a thing. I actually have people, colleagues of mine studying that, so it's okay, it's like, I get what you're trying to say, I don't know, it's interesting, we don't. Yeah, I don't know if it's an orientation thing or actually a groups that are politically progressive or, you know what I mean?
It could
Like,
be
I
a
don't-
combination of both. It could be being part of a community, you know, once you get some members, of any community, right? It's like if my friends or people I associate with are like, hey, you know, this is actually cool to do, or you know, we send each other information. And it's like, you know, I'm gonna check that out. And then so if you have some guys running the bus, so this bus is cool, then everyone else is like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool.
Could be,
For any community.
we need more people to do that then.
Any online comments or questions? 6:12. I know we usually have like 3 that are just our computer, but at least 3 are. Well, maybe we'll call it. Thank you again, Tom.